When my mother saw the two bodies lying on the floor, the blood forming a dark pool that spread across the wooden boards of my childhood bedroom, something inside her shattered in a way that could never be put back together. I still remember the oppressive hush that followed the way the rain outside seemed to pause mid-fall, as if the world itself was holding its breath. My darlings, I'm Teresa Forrest, but you can call me Grandma Teresa. And today I want to take you on a journey that begins with that frozen moment in Lexington, Kentucky, and ends on my peaceful porch here in Burlington, Vermont. Before I share what happened next, because, oh, you'll want to stick around for that. I've learned over nearly 8 decades that the first few seconds of any story are the ones that must grip you by the throat. You've probably heard it before. In the first 10 seconds, you either hook them or lose them. True crime podcasts like Serial mastered this long ago. A simple crack of a wooden floor cue, microphone static, and a voice asking, "Did he really do it?" turns millions of curious ears into devoted listeners. We all know the sting of clicking play and thinking, just one more minute only to surface hours later bleary-eyed and desperate for the next episode. That's the power of a good hook. It promises tension, mystery, and if you stay, the relief of resolution. So let me promise you this. By the time I'm finished with part 1 of my story, you'll understand why some secrets break families, why hidden authority can turn love into terror, and why sometimes the smallest actions, like a whispered promise or an unexpected knock, become the pivot on which an entire life turns. And I'll share with you how decades later, this very room still echoes in my dreams. But first, let me set the stage properly. Picture a small porch, bathed in early morning light. Adirondack chairs fading to white under years of sun and snow, and a quilted blanket tucked over my knees. Beyond the railing, the green mountains stretch out in soft waves, soothing, aren't they? That's where I sit now, a steaming cup of chamomile tea in my hands, the scent of pine drifting in on the breeze. And yet, as serene as this view is, it holds the memory of something far less peaceful. The moment a single knock rattled the front door of our humble home and changed everything. It was the summer of 1955, and I was 8 years old. But let's not rush ahead just yet. I want you to feel the weight of that first knock, the way it shattered our Sunday calm like a bullet through glass. In a moment, you'll hear how 3 authoritative raps carried more power than any loving word, how a man's rigid posture made my father tremble, and how the echo of those knocks still resonates in the boards beneath my feet. Why do we need such vivid openings? Because we're busy people, my darlings, in a world overflowing with screens and voices clamoring for our attention. Only stories that make us feel something stand a chance. I want you to feel the chill that crept down my spine that day, the sudden hush that fell over the kitchen, and the terrible question that rose in my mother's throat. Who could demand entry at this hour? Then once I've held your heart in the palm of my hand, we'll ease back into happier times. Lazy summer evenings on the porch, the smell of cornbread wafting from the wood stove kitchen, and the sound of the Cincinnati Reds on a tiny transistor radio. You'll meet my parents, Samuel and Martha, simple people building a gentle life after the war. You'll sense their pride, their routines, their laughter, and you'll understand why the intrusion of one stern man felt like a thunderclap cracking across clear blue skies. If you've ever wondered how a family portrait can hide shadows, or how one authoritative figure can bend even the strongest wills, part 1 is for you. I'll show you every creak of that old floor when he entered, describe the scent of his menthol aftershave mixing with the damp Kentucky heat, and tell you exactly how he looked down on us, as if we were little more than pieces of furniture in an inspection. You'll see how my mother's hands trembled as she smoothed her apron, how my father swallowed hard before calling him sir, and how in those tense seconds the man in the grey suit became the axis upon which our lives would forever turn. And don't worry about the giveaway. Yes, it's still running. We've reached over 30,000 subscribers, and I'm so grateful for each and every one of you. Like the video, subscribe to Grandma's Tales, and let me know in the comments. What draws you to these stories? Maybe it's the resilience, perhaps the raw honesty, or simply the wish to say, I've been through darkness too, and I survived. Because at the heart of every story worth telling is a shared truth. None of us are alone in our struggles. So settle in close, as if we're on a porch swing and the cicadas are rising in the evening air. I'll squeeze your hand with my own slightly stiff fingers and invite you to lean forward as the first clap of that knock reverberates through our tale. Only then will you truly grasp why some moments haunt us, why some knocks demand answers, and why even now I cannot step into a quiet room without feeling the weight of history all around me. Ready? Let us begin. And now, my dears, allow me to take you back to that summer afternoon in Lexington, where life felt as bright as the sun on the garden dahlias before everything changed. I was born in the summer of 1947, and by the time I was 8, it felt as though we'd been handed the keys to the American dream. My parents, Martha and Samuel Forrest, were part of that great swell of post-war families who believed that quiet streets, steady jobs, and Sunday potlucks made a life worth living. But as cozy as that image sounds, there was always more going on beneath the white picket fences than any picture postcard could show. Let me paint you a picture of Lexington, Kentucky in 1955. Elm trees arched over sidewalks, their leaves whispering secrets to children playing hopscotch in homemade chalk squares. The sun would settle into the horizon in a blush of pink, and neighbors would drift onto front porches, exchanging small talk and the latest gossip who'd baked the best apple pie, which transistor radio station was picking up the Reds game most clearly, and recipes for cornbread that would never quite match Grandma's. Our own little corner of town sat on Maple Avenue, a single-story clapboard house with peeling white paint and a cheerful blue door. My mother's pride and joy were the dahlias she coaxed into bloom every June, their vibrant petals nodding at passers-by like eager toddlers waving hello. My father, an accountant at the Templar textile factory, would come home each evening in a crisp shirt and simple tie, his hair still damp from the factory locker room shower. He had a quiet dignity about him, never one to shout, but always ready to offer help with my satchel before I walked to school. School itself was a half-mile down the road at Lexington Elementary, and I walked there every morning with nothing but a vinyl satchel and a frog lily lunchbox. My teacher, Mrs. Margaret Thompson, wore cat-eye glasses and a soft smile that made you feel like the cleverest kid in the world, even if you'd only just learned to tie your shoes. She'd read aloud from adventure novels Swiss Family, Robinson, Treasure Island, and I'd sit on the edge of my seat trembling with excitement. I remember thinking, someday I'll write or teach stories just like these. On Sundays, the whole family trooped down to First Baptist Church, its white steeple poking into blue skies like a promise of hope and renewal. We'd sing hymns, Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art, our voices blending in the acoustics of stained glass windows. Afterwards, we'd return home to a dinner of spaghetti and chicken, my father's favorite, followed by Mum's apple pie with a melting scoop of vanilla ice cream. These days were the foundation of our life-faith family, and a certain belief that kindness carried us further than wealth ever could. But every portrait has shadows at its edges. Even as children, we sensed when something was quietly amiss. I remember noticing on a humid July afternoon the way my mother paused by the front gate, smoothing her apron and glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone, or the somber look in my father's eyes when he folded the newspaper, the radio crackling Cincinnati's score by his side. These details flickered at the edges of my awareness, like the nearly imperceptible hum of a distant engine. It wasn't that our home was unhappy, far from it. We laughed, we played, we argued over who got the last slice of cornbread. But there was an unspoken rule that everything stay, just so the furniture aligned, the silverware polished until it shone, the dahlias cut to exactly 5 inches. My mother would say, "A tidy home reflects a tidy mind," and she never allowed a chair cushion to be out of place. I adored her for her warmth, her humming as she cooked, her gentle brushing of my hair in the mornings. But I also felt the tension that settled into her shoulders when strangers arrived. You see, in 1950s America, image meant everything. In our town, the textile factory was the heartbeat of the economy, and the people who ran it held sway over reputations. To be known as good, upstanding folk meant you weren't just kind. You were reliable, conservative, and just distinguished enough. Any hint of scandal, well, everyone would hear about it in the grocery store before noon the next day. My mother's own upbringing had been one of quiet deference. She grew up on a nearby farm, the daughter of 2 schoolteachers, as where children should be seen, not heard, was the standard refrain. My father's story was a similar. Except his father was Colonel Augustus Forrest, a strict military man who clipped his speech and his grandchildren's appetites with equal precision. So when Samuel married Martha, they agreed in silence that their home would be a sanctuary from Colonel Forrest's exacting ways, a bubble of acceptance in a world measured by rails and shadings and ranks. Even Sunday evenings followed a sacred routine. After dinner, we'd sit on our porch steps, drinking sweet tea and watching fireflies drift through twilight. My father, tapping his foot in time with the crickets, would say, "You know, Teresa, there's nothing quite like simple living." And at that moment, the idea of anything darker seemed impossible, as though the very notion of fear belonged to distant lands, not to our corner of Kentucky. In truth, this calm was a delicate illusion, like believing the surface of a pond is the whole of its being. Beneath it, currents swirl. And I'd learn soon enough, in ways no child should, how authority can be both comforting and terrifying, how the very man who fought battles overseas could unsettle the battleground at home. But in that golden chapter before the storm, I clung to every small joy, the taste of cornbread fresh from the oven, the echo of my father's low laughter, the softness of my mother's whisper when she tucked me into bed each night. For any American watching today, especially those who grew up in the 40s and 50s, this might sound familiar. The sense that if you measured up to society's checklist, you'd be safe. A good job, a pretty house, a smiling family, in all boxes ticked, and then you exhaled, certain you'd passed the test. But history, and as I discovered, life has a way of showing us that perfection is a fragile veneer. As I sit here now, more than 70 years later, I can still feel the warmth of those mid-century summers, the scent of honeysuckle drifting past the porch rail, and the distant hum of the factory whistle at 5 o'clock sharp. No one could have blamed me for believing our life was bulletproof. We had faith, we had each other, and we had no idea how quickly one knock on that blue door would unravel every comfort we'd ever known. So hold on to that image, the dahlias nodding in the breeze, my father's neatly pressed suit, the steaming pot of spaghetti on the stove. Treasure those quiet moments in your own life too, the simple routines that feel so stable. Because, my darling, those are the moments you'll yearn for when the shadows creep in. And speaking of shadows, I'll tell you exactly how they slipped through our perfectly screened door in just a few minutes. But first, take a deep breath. Let the memory of that porch settle in, and remind yourself that even the sunniest days can hide storms on the horizon. Next, we'll meet the man whose rigid discipline would soon eclipse every ounce of warmth in our home, my grandfather, Colonel Augustus Forrest. You'll see why his very presence felt like an inspection march, why his footsteps echoed louder than any thunderclap, and how his first words to us would carry more weight than any sermon. Stay close, dear friends. The calm before the storm is almost over. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when the shadow first fell across our doorstep. No storm clouds, no warning salvo of thunder, just three sharp raps that cut through the Sunday-like calm of our home. I was 10 years old, perched on the bottom step of our porch, pulling petals off a daisy and murmuring, he loves me not. My mother was inside, humming a hymn, and my father was dozing in his chair by the kitchen window. The afternoon sun, painting stripes on his grey hair. When those knocks came three deliberate, confident raps, it was as if the world had paused. My mother's humming halted mid-note. My father blinked awake, the crease in his brow deepening. I looked up, puzzled, then dropped the daisy petals and slipped silently through the screen door to stand behind my mother in the foyer. Samuel, she called, voice gentle. Someone's at the door. He rose, smoothing his shirt, trying to straighten a tie that wasn't there. He'd long ago traded formal wear for crisp shirts without neckwear. He rounded the corner into the hallway, and as he did, I caught the first glimpse of him. Colonel Augustus Forrest, my grandfather. He stood tall, his posture unyielding, shoulders squared like a soldier inspection. His crisp grey uniform suit, worn only by his own design, but immaculate nonetheless, seemed unsuited to Kentucky heat. A brass officer's pin gleamed on the lapel, and at his side rode a classic Colt .45 in a smooth leather holster. That gun, half hidden beneath his jacket, was less a weapon than a branding iron, an assertion that he carried authority like breath itself. Father Samuel said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped aside. My grandfather entered, without wiping his boots on the doormat, as if the threshold were beneath him. He carried with him the sharp scent of mentholated aftershave and the faint click of polished leather against hardwood. My mother's apron fluttered as she hurried forward, smoothing her skirt with trembling hands. Martha. He nodded curtly. Not a hug, not a kiss, only a nod. Where is my son? His voice was calm, measured, but every syllable carried the iron weight of command. In the living room, my mother answered, voice steady but soft. You're just in time for lunch. He looked out at our modest dining room, a table mismatched to the oak floor's chairs, scraped and worn. His steely blue eyes scanned the walls, the faded portraits of my parents' wedding, the small vase of dahlias on the windowsill. Quite humble, he observed, lips barely moving. But I suppose it'll do. My father swallowed. We're glad to have you, sir. He used the title for the first time, I realized, calling his own father sir in our home. I felt a twist in my heart at that small shift. Colonel Forrest sat at the head of the table, the place of honor that once belonged to my father. He folded his hands on the tablecloth, fragrant with my mother's lavender starch, and regarded us as though we were audience and spectacle both. He did not partake of the cornbread my mother had baked, though its golden aroma filled the room. Instead, he drank slowly from a glass of water. Lips pursed as if tasting our hospitality. Between bites of roast chicken tender seasoned with herbs from our garden, he spoke. Not a welcome nor a greeting, but an assessment. Tell me, Samuel, how is my granddaughter faring in her studies? My father glanced at me and I stammered. Aunt Emmeline sends notes. My grades are above average, sir. I could feel my cheeks flush. Average? He repeated, arching an eyebrow. A Forrest does not content himself with average. Even at 8 years old, I felt those words as a condemnation, as if my very existence were a failure of lineage. My mother offered a quick apology, an extra ladle of gravy to soften his critique, but he merely waved it away, eyes fixed on me with cold appraisal. That first visit set the tone for every subsequent one. Over the next weeks, Colonel Forrest arrived unannounced on Wednesdays, Saturdays, Sundays, any day that carried the slightest hint of routine. He conducted his inspections with military precision. He measured the carpet pile with a fingertip, tapped a glass against a fork to test its ring, and scrutinized the backs of chairs for dust motes. He issued commands. A forest keeps a military bearing at all times. Your salt and pepper belong 6 inches apart. Let me see your notebooks, then pronounced us wanting. In the context of 1950s America, his behavior wasn't unique. The Cold War was in full swing, and military culture seeped into civilian life like ink in water. Discipline was a virtue, rigidity a strength. Mothers ironed crisp uniforms for Sundays. Fathers studied ROTC manuals at the community center, and children saluted even in family photographs. Yet the same structures that promised order also opened doors for abuse. When authority goes unchecked, when respect becomes fear, household rules can morph into tools of control. I later learned that elder abuse is a hidden epidemic even today. The National Council on Aging reports that 1 in 10 Americans over 60 suffers some form of abuse by someone they trust. In my grandfather's case, his uniform and medals provided an unassailable shield. Who would question a decorated war hero? Who would dare defy a man who once commanded troops overseas? So his tirades, small at first, then sweeping, went unchallenged. Your posture, he'd say to my father, voice low enough for only us to hear, is unbefitting an officer's son. My mother's shoulders would slump as she hurried to rearrange cushions. My own spine would straighten instinctively as if standing at attention. The invisible drill sergeant of my grandfather's gaze taught me to police my every move. Between his critiques, he slipped gifts onto our table, a silver stationery set that my mother arranged in a frosty display, a porcelain doll for me, her velvet dress too expensive for a child's play, and books on classical literature that gathered dust. Each gift carried a barb. A prize deserves proper display. A young lady must cultivate refinement. Good stories expand the mind, do yours. Yet these offerings never felt generous. They were reminders of my grandfather's power. He could lavish you with treasures, then scold you for not being worthy. He ruled by a perfect blend of carrot and stick. It was a mastery of control that I would later study in leadership seminars and corporate trainings. How incentives and punishments shape behavior. But back then, I only understood the fear they instilled. At night, we lay awake, listening for the click of his boots on the porch. My mother would whisper, "Perhaps he's forgotten something," and I'd lie rigid, pretending sleep, afraid that a single turn of my head would draw his gaze. My father retreated into his study, slamming the door softly so that walls might muffle his curses. Through it all, I clung to the small solace of my teacher's words. Stories can set us free. I wrote in my notebook by candlelight, filling page after page, with tall tales of castles and knights of heroes who conquered darkness. In those scribbles, I found a refuge from the unrelenting inspections of my grandfather's world. Despite the suffocating pressure, there were moments when my grandfather revealed a different face. On one summer evening, after a particularly harsh critique of my spelling, he paused at the door, the sun gilding his silhouette. "Teresa," he said, almost softly, "remember that discipline is the root of greatness. I believe you have it in you." His words were like a drop of water hitting parched earth, unexpected and yet quickly evaporating in the heat of his next reproach. I stored that small kindness in my heart, replaying it whenever I feared I might break. What I didn't realize then was how common his methods were. I would grow up to read about authoritarian parenting, a style linked to higher levels of anxiety, depression, and even long-term health issues. Psychologists warn that children raised under constant threat of disapproval internalize a damaging belief that love is conditional. But back in our house on Maple Avenue, such insights were decades away from mainstream awareness. By the time I turned 11, my mother's laughter had become rare. She moved through the house like a ghost, trimming dahlias, with trembling hands, humming hymns to keep from crying. My father's gentle humor faded. He rarely munched on chicken, and the transistor radio broadcast grew quieter in our living room. I realized with a child's clarity that authority wielded without empathy leaves nothing but hollow obedience. Still, every portrait needs its contrast. Outside our walls, neighbors waved cheerily, potlucks continued, and the factory whistle still called Father's home at 5. Life in Lexington carried on as if our home were just another house on the block, because no one would have suspected that behind our blue door lay an unending inspection. And that, my dear listeners, is how the patriarchy arrived in our home, not with a grand announcement, but with a quiet authority that seeped into every corner. The man who'd fought battles for his country was waging a war of his own against the souls of his family. In the next part of our story, we'll see how psychological control turned physical, and how I learned that sometimes the greatest act of courage is to fight back against the one you were taught to respect most of all. Until then, remember, respect is earned, but fear can be demanded. And a home built on fear is no home at all. From the very first unannounced visit, the true power of Colonel Forrest's authority revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in the small, almost imperceptible shifts he imposed on our daily life. You might think that overt cruelty, yelling, striking, or overt threats would leave the deepest scars. Yet it was the quiet control, the tiny corrections delivered with a calm voice that crept into my spirit and eroded our family's sense of safety. He began by tweaking the simplest routines. At breakfast, he insisted that the place settings be arranged exactly 12 inches from the edge of the table. If a spoon sat a quarter-inch too close, he merely tapped it aside without a word, letting the click reverberate like a reprimand. Over time, my mother would measure with a ruler, meticulously adjusting forks and knives as though the table were a general's war map, and every piece of silverware a battalion that must stand in perfect formation. In the living room, he frowned at our modest couch, insisting that the cushions be fluffed precisely 5 times before he sat. I watched my mother rise from her chair, her apron strings tight in her fist, and pat, pat, pat the pillows as if each fluff could earn her his approval. A single indentation, left unplumped, felt to her like a public admission of failure. But it wasn't just chairs and cutlery. His eyes pierced ordinary conversation. When I tried to tell him about a spelling bee I'd won at school, he sighed as though unenthusiastic. "Congrats," he said, voice flat. "But what good is spelling if you can't communicate clearly in person?" I felt the words stick in my throat, as though my accomplishment had been swallowed by a black hole of disappointment. In that moment, I learned that praise could be withheld as easily as punishment could be delivered, and that withholding praise could sometimes hurt more. One evening, after I'd brought home a paper decorated with a gold star, my grandmother's eyes lit up. She reached to hug me, but Colonel Forrest waved her away, saying, "Better you learn humility now than arrogance later." My grandmother's stiffened lips pressed hard. I stood frozen, clutching my star-laden page, wondering if I had won or lost. These small acts of control, sometimes called micro-abuses or covert emotional manipulation, are surprisingly devastating. As family therapy professionals note, they operate like slow poison. Each tiny correction, each dismissive word, builds a shadow in the heart. Over time, children and spouses learn to anticipate the next slight tethering their self-worth to the approval of the abuser rather than to their own values or accomplishments. Psychologists identify this pattern as a form of gaslighting, making someone question their reality, their achievements, and ultimately their identity. Although the term was coined in the 20th century, the technique is centuries old. In my grandfather's case, it was as if he had a manual titled How to Dominate Without Raising Your Voice. He'd learned to sharpen his power in whispers, turning a kind word into a double-edged sword, and a compliment into a setup for disappointment. At first, we all tried to adapt. My father, once steady and warm, began arriving home earlier to refluff the cushions before his father's unexpected checks. He'd hover at the edge of the living room, eyes darting anxiously to the clock. My mother stowed away decorative trinkets that might offend his minimalist sensibilities and ironed my school uniform until the seams shone. Even I began double-checking my homework, erasing entire paragraphs at the faintest hint of a stray pencil mark. But patterns like these seldom end in harmony. The more we tried to please him, the more impossible his standards became. At night, I'd lie awake listening to my father's size 12th shoes scuffing softly down the hallway as he tried to regain the calm he'd lost. He once confessed to my mother, "I never thought I'd feel like a child again, waiting for my father's mercy." My mother simply held his hand, and I realized she was fighting her own battle of helplessness. It was during this period that I discovered a small island of resistance, my writing desk. While grandfather criticized our grammar and scorned our poor composition, I labored over stories with secret delight, describing brave queens who defied tyrants or young heroes who toppled unjust kings. In those pages, I whispered my own truth, that kindness could overcome cruelty, that small acts of bravery matter. Every sentence was a vow that I would cherish my voice, no matter how often someone tried to stifle it. I encourage families watching today to remember this small, controlling behaviors are often the first harbingers of deeper abuse. Dr. Elaine Hall, a leading expert in family dynamics, warns that micro-abuses chip away at self-esteem in a way that overt violence sometimes cannot, because they masquerade as concern or discipline. If someone in your life insists on rearranging your spaces, correcting your accomplishments, or minimizing your achievements, and does so with a gentle smile, take notice. Confronting a redecorating critique or a backhanded compliment might feel trivial, but early awareness can prevent entrenched fear. In our home, the tipping point wasn't a single dramatic event, but the accumulation of tiny wounds. Dinner conversations became exercises in trepidation. Anyone's laugh that rose too loud, anyone's gesture that lingered too long would draw a piercing glance. My mother, once so bright, began to move through her days like a careful dancer, avoiding missteps at all costs. And I, 8 years old but growing wise, started to wonder if a home built on such brittle perfection could ever offer real comfort. Yet through it all, my grandmother, despite her reverence for her husband, would catch my eye from across the room with a quiet spark. In those milliseconds, I felt her solidarity, recognition that the rules were unfair, that nobody should live in such constant fear. She'd wink or brush my hair gently, even when he was watching. Those gestures reminded me that empathy can survive even the sternest discipline. If I could offer one simple takeaway from these years, it would be guard your small joys fiercely. The lightness of laughter, the freedom to make a mess, the beauty of an unmeasured hug. These are the crack through which the sun enters. When someone demands that you measure your silverware or correct your accomplishments before offering praise, remember that you deserve more. Real love celebrates imperfections, stumbles, and spontaneous gestures without turning them into lessons in humility. As the weeks turned into months, I found allies beyond our walls. Mrs. Thompson, my teacher, began praising my writing in front of the class, saying Teresa has a vivid imagination and a brave heart. To hear praise spoken plainly and wholeheartedly filled me with hope. It reminded me that for every micro-abuse, there is a countermeasure: genuine acknowledgement, authentic encouragement, and unconditional kindness. In the next chapter of our story, you'll see the moment when the micro-abuses crossed an invisible boundary into overt physical threat, and how the strength I'd nurtured in secret stories would become my guiding light. So keep your hearts open and your senses alert, because sometimes the whispers of control grow into shouts, and the smallest lesson in discipline heralds the greatest need for courage. That night began like so many others in our household. Quiet routine, and steeped in the comforting rituals of family life. My father's briefcase sat by the front door's inset mat, ready for his early morning departure to Louisville. My mother hummed softly as she prepared my school satchel, and I carefully pegged on my vinyl lunch bag strap, the familiar weight a source of comfort. Outside, the sky was low and grey, but no rain had yet fallen. He should have come home first. That was the rule. Saturdays meant family dinners. But my father's trip had been delayed an unexpected meeting with factory suppliers, he'd said, and by dinner time he still hadn't appeared. My mother's humming grew more tentative, then faded altogether as she passed dish after dish of rice and beans. Beans onto the table. She insisted dinner continue, her voice wavering between calm and brittle. "We'll eat first," she said, smoothing her apron. "Your father will be here soon." I sat beside her at the small wood kitchen table, spoon halfway to my mouth, when we heard it 3 firm raps on the front door, as deliberate and crisp as a military salute. My mother's hand froze on her ladle. I felt my heart lurch, remembering all the times my grandfather's visits had imposed an undercurrent of dread beneath our domestic calm. "He shouldn't be here," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not without Sam." I didn't wait for her to tell me twice. I slipped from my chair, precision born of years of practice, and crept down the hallway to my bedroom at the back of the house. I closed the door as quietly as I could, but I left it ajar just enough to see. In those seconds before the door swung open, I remember thinking, this doesn't feel like discipline. Something's different tonight. The hallway light flickered in the dim, and I saw my grandfather's silhouette fill the frame. Tall, broad-shouldered suit jacket unbuttoned in the muggy air, the outline of his Colt beneath the lapel. "Teresa." His voice was low but firm. No pleasantries, no preamble. "Open the door." My legs felt as though they were rooted to the floorboards. Something cold and slick ran through me, deeper than fear, dread. I didn't know why he was here without my father. I only knew his visits without Sam were the worst. I stayed still, eyes wide, willing my breathing to be silent. Then I heard the screen door scrape a sound like nails across slate, and his heavy footsteps approach. "Open it, child," he said louder this time. The bar rattled as he lifted it, and I realized I had no choice. My mother's voice drifted from the other side of the house. "Don't make it harder than it needs to be, Augustus." But her calm had an edge of panic that cut sharper than any whip. I pushed back the door, heart hammering. The corridor beyond seemed narrower, as though his presence had closed the walls in on me. He stepped inside, cigar smoke and menthol drifting in his wake. "I told your father I'd inspect things tonight," he said, scanning the living room floor furniture, the small radio set on its stand. Business must continue regardless of schedules. My mother appeared behind him, smoothing her skirt and keeping her gaze fixed on the floor. She offered tea, my favorite chamomile blend, but he waved her away. "I didn't come for refreshments," he said. I came for my granddaughter. Those words settled around me like ice. He advanced, the soft thud of his shoes on carpet, louder than any storm. I backed into my room, pressing my hand against the wall to guide my steps. "Go to your chair," he ordered. His tone brooked no refusal. I saw my white-painted rocker by the window, the place where I read when I was alone. I sat, knees pulled tight to my chest, clutching the arms as if they might protect me. He stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching. "Eyes up," he said. "A soldier never bows her head." Every muscle in my body trembled, but I forced my chin up. My grandfather's gaze held a rigid expectation, no softness, no hint of warmth. He circled the room, inspecting every corner until he stood in front of me less than a foot away. "Do you understand why I brought the rifle cartridge I showed your father this morning?" His voice was steady. I shook my head. Lips too dry to form words. He tapped the holster at his side. "Power demands knowledge. I need to know you respect it." My chest constricted. Respect was one thing, fear was another. I realized then that this was no longer about teaching discipline. It was about reminding me who held the reins. I whispered, "Yes, sir." He reached out to take my hand, not gently, but with a firmness that made the bones in my palm whimper. He placed it on the holster's grip. "Feel that weight," he said. "Know its promise." Behind him, I heard my mother's soft cry and a muffled shuffle of her breath as she tried to steady herself. She whispered, "Please, don't." He turned on her like a pivoted gun barrel. "Silence," he said. I felt the tight coil of panic unwind in my stomach, giving way to a cold determination. Little Teresa knew then that power unbridled can become a terror. I thought of my father's warm hands and gentle voice, of Mrs. Thompson's proud nod when I wrote stories about brave girls. I steeled myself. "Grandpa," I said, voice trembling but louder than a whisper. "I'm scared." His hand tightened around mine. "Scared is weak," he said, voice low. "A forest does not cower." I thought maybe so, but fear tells me I'm alive. Before he could retract his grip, I yanked my hand away and sprang from the chair. His eyes narrowed, and for a heartbeat I felt time stretch thin. "Enough," my mother yelled, stepping into the room so suddenly that both of them staggered. Her face was pale tears, glinting like rain on window panes. I darted past her, bolting down the hallway. I knew exactly where to go, Mrs. Judith's house next door, where my father had told me to run if anything ever went wrong. I reached the front door, and it flew open as I swung it. The humid air outside felt like freedom, alive with crickets and the hum of distant traffic. I sprinted across the porch and pounded on Mrs. Judith's screen door. It rattled, then opened to reveal her kind face framed in lamplight. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my grandfather step outside, anger crackling around him like lightning. But I didn't look back. I only dove into Mrs. Judith's arms, sobbing. He tried to make me touch the gun. I was so scared. She closed the door behind me, ushered me to a chair, and wrapped her shawl around my shoulders. "You did the right thing, sweetheart," she murmured. "Just breathe." I could hear raised voices beyond the walls of her house. My grandfather's accusations, my mother's pleading. But I remained in Mrs. Judith's gentle cocoon tears, still hot on my cheeks, breathing in the scent of lavender soap and calm. Later, when the neighbors peered from porches and called the sheriff, I learned that my mother had demanded he stay back, that she'd shouted for protection. And though my grandfather boasted of his rank, the sight of me safe in another woman's arms made even him hesitate. They say the storm broke that night, and it wasn't the rumble of thunder overhead, but the shattering realization that discipline, when untethered from care, becomes cruelty. In that moment, I discovered I could choose myself over fear, and that sometimes the bravest act is to run toward help, not away from it. It was the first time I understood the difference between authority that guides and authority that terrorizes. And as I sat in Mrs. Bear, Judith's kitchen wrapped in her shawl, I resolved that no matter who held power, I would honor my right to safety, to kindness, to respect. In the days that followed, my father back early from Louisville, alerted by Mrs. Judith, confronted his father with a ferocity I'd never seen. And though the outcome would reshape our family, it was my choice that set it in motion. But that, my dear friends, is the turning point we'll explore next. How the bonds of fear snapped under the weight of love and courage, and how a little girl's flight for safety changed everything. Hold tight to that thought. Freedom often begins with a single step out the door. In the days after that fateful night, our home felt unmoored, as though the very foundations had been torn away. I still remember the soft pad of my father's footsteps down the hallway. Before dawn, the hush of his voice as he whispered to my mother, "It's done." I clutched the edges of my blanket heart, pounding, uncertain if he meant the nightmare was over or only beginning. By sunrise, our modest living room had been transformed into a makeshift arm's-length battlefield. The sheriff's deputies stood in the doorway, eyes courteous but firm. My grandfather's Colt lay on the coffee table, its polished steel glinting like a wound that refused to heal. My mother stood beside my father. Her hand trembled on his forearm, but her chin was raised, resolve glowing in her tired eyes. I was 9 years old, no longer the carefree student who spun in daisies, now a witness to shock sorrow and the strange relief of surviving. Yet even amid the turmoil, I sensed a quiet shift happening deep within me. The understanding that in moments of crisis, a child's agency can become the very spark of survival. When my father knelt beside me that morning, sunlight filtering through the curtains and casting soft rectangles on the carpet, he asked, voice gentle, "Teresa, do you remember what we talked about?" My mind flashed back to his urgent instructions before he left for Louisville. Stay close to your mother. Never be alone with him. And if you ever feel unsafe, run to Mrs. Judith's. I nodded, quivering. He squeezed my hand. You were brave. You did exactly the right thing. In his eyes, I caught a mixture of pride and sorrow that made me feel both small and grown up all at once. In the crisis-driven rush of that morning, our roles shifted. My mother, who had once seemed fragile, found a strength I'd never seen. She directed the deputies toward the kitchen, explaining calmly, "He has the weapon there." And though she could barely hold back tears, she stood tall, confronting a man who'd held our family in fear. The deputies retrieved the pistol, secured it, and escorted my grandfather, still in his uniform suit, but no longer towering like a conqueror, out into the dewy morning air. His eyes avoided mine. The rigid authority had faltered. As they led him away, I felt the air around us shift, the oppressive weight of his presence lightened, replaced by something like possibility. Later, over subdued bowls of oatmeal in the kitchen, I watched my father and the sheriff discuss next steps. My mother tended to me, brushing back my tangled hair and offering sips of warm milk. And though I was exhausted, body and soul, I sensed that this moment marked a turning point. The crisis had demanded that I act, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a piece of myself that fear had nearly stolen. Child psychologists talk about fight, flight, or freeze, the instinctual responses to trauma. That night I had chosen flight. I ran toward help, toward safety, and in that act of moving away from danger, I found a power I didn't know I possessed. Sometimes the bravest act is not standing your ground, but finding the courage to run, to seek protection, and rally support. As the day wore on, neighbours whispered behind lace curtains, and the soft hum of the factory whistle sounded more like a tribute to survival than a reminder of routine. My teacher, Mrs. Thompson, arrived at our door, clutching a bouquet of daisies, the same kind I used to play with. She hugged me gently. "I'm so proud of you, Teresa," she said. "You showed wisdom beyond your years." Her praise felt like sunlight after a storm, yet the path to healing was only beginning. That afternoon, my parents decided we would leave Lexington. They packed our suitcases in silence, as though speaking aloud would summon the dread all over again. I placed my favorite notebook filled with stories of queens who challenged kings into my small overnight bag, determined to carry my inner world of resilience with me. On our last evening in that home, my mother stood on the porch, the same place where I once pulled daisy petals. She drew me close and said, "Remember, darling, you are never powerless. You have a voice, and when you use it, you honor both your fear and your courage." I leaned my head on her shoulder, the pink and violet sky stretching above us, and let her words sink in. In the car the next morning, our neighbours, Mary and Roy, following us to the train station, we passed Maple Avenue one final time. The clapboard house looked smaller now, overshadowed by the memory of what had happened. But I held tight to the knowledge that crisis had revealed a truth: even the youngest among us can make life or death choices. When I arrived in upstate New York, weeks later, life felt both foreign and hopeful. I started a new school where no one knew my name or my scars. At first I felt raw wary of authority, suspicious of sudden knocks. But I also carried with me the fire of survival. In classrooms, I raised my hand more often, eager to share ideas. On playgrounds, I chose friends who listened, who laughed, and who respected boundaries. In journals and letters to Mrs. Thompson, I wrote about our move, our new house, and the promise of fresh starts. I sketched our family's future, my father teaching accounting classes despite his injury, my mother opening a little craft shop, and me writing stories, always writing stories. My words became a lifeline, anchoring me to hope. Over time, I learned that crisis can be a crucible for growth. When we face the darkest moments, our responses, our choices to seek help, to speak out, to protect ourselves, become the building blocks of resilience. Researchers note that children who navigate trauma with supportive adults often emerge with post-traumatic growth, the ability to find strength, meaning, and empathy in the aftermath. And so I carried my crisis-driven survival into adulthood. I volunteered at women's shelters, taught creative writing to at-risk youth, and shared my story in community centers, always with the same warm, intimate tone my grandmotherly voice carries now. Because I believe that when we share our darkest moments, we give others permission to voice their own fears and triumphs. If you're watching today and you've ever felt powerless, remember, this crisis does not define you. Your response does. You have choices, even when options seem scarce. You can reach out, you can speak up, you can take a single step towards safety. That step may seem small, running next door, dialing a hotline, confiding in a friend, but it plants a seed of empowerment. As the golden morning light fades into afternoon here on my porch in Vermont, I invite you to reflect on your own moments of crisis. How did you respond? What choices illuminated your path forward? And if you're still gathering courage, know that you're not alone. A community of voices, your family, your friends, even strangers like me, stands ready to support you. In our next chapter, we'll examine the delicate art of narrative control, how families shape the stories we tell about trauma, why partial truths sometimes protect us, and the hidden costs of silence. Because telling our stories fully is another act of agency. another step in reclaiming our voices. Until then, may you carry the warmth of this moment and the reminder that even in the darkest hours, your own bravery can light the way. In the hushed hours after my father was wheeled into surgery, our house felt adrift in time. The antiseptic scent of hospital corridors still clung to my mother's clothes when she returned home alone that night. Her face an impassive mask that I knew all too well. When I climbed the porch steps, I found her on the edge of our swing, rocking gently in the dark. "Come here, sweetheart," she said, patting the seat beside her. I curled against her side, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the yard. "I want to tell you something important," she began, voice low, "about what happened tonight." I nodded, bracing myself. I thought she would tell me to be brave, to pray, to wait. Instead, she placed her hand over mine and whispered, "We're going to say your grandfather died of a heart attack." Her words hung in the air between us, warmer than the summer breeze, yet colder than any truth I'd ever known. A heart attack. In the official account, my grandfather had simply suffered a fatal cardiac event moments after the shot intended for my father misfired. The pistols, the threats, none of that would be spoken aloud. "Mum," I whispered. But it wasn't a heart attack. It was me. I stabbed him. Her lips quivered for a fraction of a second before she drew a steady breath. "I know, darling. You did what you had to do to protect your father, and you did it courageously. But if the full truth came out, they might take you away from me. People might say you were too young to understand, that you were unstable, that you—" Her voice cracked, and she caught it before it broke completely. "We can't let them rewrite our lives," she finished. I stared at the porch rail where the paint had chipped away beneath my father's weight. I felt torn pride in my brave act, sorrow for the lies we now wove around it. In that moment, I realized narrative control, the power to shape the story, was as vital as any self-defense. My mother understood that the world often believes the neat, polite version of events over the messy, painful reality. In the days that followed, our home became a stage. My mother coached me on what to say if anyone asked. Answer simply, "Grandpa collapsed. You didn't see anything." She practiced the lines with me, her tone calm but urgent. I felt like an actor rehearsing a script that no one in the audience would suspect was faked. When the local newspaper ran the obituary, it spoke of Colonel Augustus Forrest's illustrious career, his dedication to community, and his sudden passing after a private moment of reflection. No mention of violence, no hint of scandal. Readers nodded along, shed respectful tears, and moved on to the next headline. This careful curation of events isn't unique to our family. Think of high-profile court cases in recent years, where public relations teams spin narratives to shield reputations. A celebrity's misunderstanding in a bar fight becomes a disagreement. A corporate scandal becomes an isolated incident, and a politician's error in judgment is suddenly a lapse under extraordinary stress. The polished statement delivered with a sympathetic tone steers public perception far more effectively than raw facts ever could. My mother wasn't crafting a media strategy for profit or power. She was protecting her child and her husband in a world that might not understand or forgive a 9-year-old girl who stabbed her own grandfather. In her mind, the lie was a shield. I eventually saw it as a bridge between our truth and the world's expectations. But narrative control carries hidden costs. Each time we repeated the heart attack story at the police station to curious relatives, to neighbors dropping off casseroles, we chipped away at our own memories. The real events receded like a shoreline at low tide, leaving only the official version behind. And with that erasure came a quiet ache, the knowledge that part of our family's history was unspoken, buried beneath a veneer of civility. Psychologists have observed that when families conceal trauma, the silence can become its own source of pain. Children sense the lie, even if they can't articulate it. They grow up attuned to the unspoken tension, the hushed conversations, the scrutinizing looks exchanged behind closed doors. In my case, each retelling of Grandpa died peacefully, echoed in me as both a relief and a betrayal. Yet there were practical benefits too. The hospital staff, unaware of the true cause of my grandfather's fall, offered my father a discounted pension for wartime service in honor of his father's memory. Our neighbors continued inviting us to block parties, oblivious to the violence that had erupted behind our walls. We could maintain our dignity, our social standing, and most importantly, our family unity, tenuous though it was. As I moved through adolescence, the dual narratives followed me, the secret I carried like a small pulsating ember, and the official story I told to teachers, classmates, and friends. I learned to shift seamlessly between them like changing keys in a song. It became second nature to smile and nod when someone murmured condolences, while my heart thundered with the unspoken truth. Over time, I discovered that some truths are too painful to share openly, especially when those truths could cause irrevocable harm. But I also realized that living solely by half-truths meant denying my own experiences. The balance between honesty and protection is delicate, and every family must find its own way. Later in life, when I volunteered at support groups for survivors of domestic abuse, I heard countless stories of families who, like mine, chose narrative control to survive. Women who framed their escape from violence as moving to follow a new job. Adolescents who said, "I got the scholarship," instead of "I fled my home," siblings who whispered, "She's abroad," rather than "She's in rehab." Each partial truth was a lifeline amidst societal pressures and legal barriers. I learned that protecting a family can mean telling a story that the world is ready to hear, not the one you'd write if you had no constraints. And sometimes those constraints, legal, cultural, social, aren't easily changed. A court system that doubts a child's testimony, a community that shuns scandal, a media landscape that simplifies complexity. These forces shape what stories get told and which ones are buried. But there is a cost to living in half-truths. Every unspoken detail forms a knot in the heart. Every polished statement carries a shadow. For me, the lies wrought a years-long ripple. I doubted my own memories, questioned my own role in the story, and struggled with guilt for having concealed the worst night of my childhood. In time, I found ways to reclaim those hidden truths. I wrote them down in journals reserved for no eyes but mine. I shared fragments with trusted therapists who helped me untangle memory from shame. And eventually I spoke openly about that night in community talks, not condemning my mother's choices, but exploring the complexity of survival. If there's one lesson I hope you take from our narrative control, it is this. Telling the whole truth is not always possible, but honoring parts of it is essential. You can choose when, where, and to whom you share your pain. You can decide which details to protect and which to reveal. In doing so, you reclaim agency over your own story. As I sit here on my porch, recalling those whispered rehearsals of a lie, I feel gratitude for my mother's fierce love and compassion for the burden she bore in shaping our narrative. We told the world what it needed to hear, yet I kept my private archives of memory safeguarding my truth until the day I was ready to speak it aloud. In our next chapter, we'll journey into healing, how to move from crisis and concealment toward restoration and authenticity. We'll explore practical steps therapy, community creative expression, to weave together fragmented truths into a tapestry of resilience. Because the greatest power of narrative is not just in what you tell others, but in how you tell yourself who you truly are. When we finally settled in that small upstate New York town, its bright main street dotted with maple trees and cozy storefronts, I felt the first tentative stirrings of hope. Our new house was modest, pale yellow clapboards, a tiny front porch, and a rambling backyard where fireflies danced at dusk. But to me, it felt like a fresh page, a chance to write a different story. My mother hung wind chimes by the door, gentle reminders that beauty can follow hardship. My father, though, still recovering from his injury, insisted on planting a vegetable garden in neat rows, as if each seed were a promise of renewal. And I, clutching my beloved notebook, began my own ritual each morning, sitting on the porch steps. With a mug of cocoa, I wrote about our new life sunlit paths instead of dark hallways, laughter around the dinner table instead of silent inspections. Yet even in the warmth of a fresh start, the echoes of Lexington followed me. Nightmares visited in the form of thunderclaps, as though storms carried my grandfather's voice. Some mornings I would wake trembling, the taste of fear still on my tongue. I realized that moving houses erased geography, but not memory. Healing, I learned, requires more than distance. It needs intention, community, and a nurturing of the soul. Finding a circle of understanding. The first step in our healing journey was seeking professional support. My mother, ever pragmatic, reached out to the local church's family outreach program and discovered a counselor who specialized in trauma. On my first visit, I remember sitting in a bright room papered with soothing blues, clutching a tissue, as I told the fragments of my story. Some true, some still cloaked in that heart attack narrative. The counselor, Mrs. Reyes, nodded gently and said, "You're safe here. We'll walk this path together." Her words unfurled a tight knot in my chest, and I realized that sharing my fear with someone who truly listened was itself a balm. Around the same time, I joined a weekly creative writing workshop at the public library. It was run by Mrs. Harper, a retired schoolteacher with a voice that sounded like warm tea. She encouraged each of us students, retirees, stay-at-home parents to bring our raw words and shape them into poems, short stories, or personal essays. When I read aloud a piece about a young girl hiding behind a door, many of my fellow writers reached out afterward, offering understanding smiles. They didn't know my exact story, but they had faced their own trials, divorce, illness, loss. And in our shared vulnerability, I found a sense of belonging. Building new traditions at home. At home, my parents and I invented small rituals to replace the rigid routines of our past. On Friday evenings, we held family story night. Each of us, no matter how old, took turns sharing a memory, a dream, or even a silly anecdote. Sometimes we laughed until tears rolled. Other times we spoke softly about hopes for the future. One night, I read my very first attempt at a fairy tale sequel to Swiss Family Robinson, complete with talking parrots and hidden treasure. My father clapped so loudly I thought he might bruise, and my mother wiped her eyes in proud delight. We also planted sunflowers along the backyard fence, tall, cheerful blooms that tracked the sun each morning. Their bright faces felt like nature's applause, reminding me that growth often follows dark seasons. Reaching out to help others. Perhaps the most transformative step was when I realized that my story could serve as a light for someone else. I began volunteering at the local women's shelter, reading bedtime stories to children whose parents were rebuilding their lives after domestic violence. As I knelt by a bunk bed and read about brave princesses, I saw those kids' eyes light up, and I thought of my own nightmares. In comforting them, I comforted myself. The shelter staff often invited me to facilitate writing circles for the parents, giving them space to voice fears and name aspirations. Together, we transformed pain into poetry. Through the shelter, I met a social worker who invited me to speak at a community forum about child safety and the importance of teaching kids when and how to seek help. Standing at that podium, heart pounding, voice steady, I shared the story of my own flight to Mrs. Judith's house, emphasizing that running towards safety is courage, not cowardice. Parents and educators thanked me afterward, some with tears in their eyes, and I realized that my experience could reshape how families think about crisis response. Embracing professional resources. In parallel, I attended Al-Anon meetings with my mother, spaces designed for those affected by another's addiction or controlling behavior. Though our situation differed, the principles of support, anonymity, and mutual understanding applied. Hearing others speak of setting boundaries and practicing self-care gave me tools to navigate my own emotions. One lesson that stayed with me was the Serenity Prayer's reminder to distinguish what I could change my responses, my choices from what I could not, other people's behavior or the past. I also explored trauma-informed yoga classes at a community center. The gentle movements and focus on breathing helped me inhabit my body again after years of tensing against fear. Lying on a soft mat, eyes closed to the scent of lavender essential oil, I learned to release tension held in my shoulders and hips, physical echoes of emotional scars. Forging a new identity. With time, these layers of support therapy, writing, volunteering, peer groups, and somatic practices wove together to form a tapestry of resilience. I no longer saw myself solely as the little girl who stabbed her grandfather, nor just the child who hid behind doors. I was a storyteller, an advocate, a gardener of sunflowers, a volunteer who transformed trauma into empathy. Each role buoyed my sense of self-worth. I celebrated milestones the day I read a personal essay about my childhood to a packed room at the library. The evening my father harvested our first homegrown tomatoes. The Saturday when my mother taught me to bake a peach pie. No rigid recipes, just the freedom to measure by heart. These were the markers of healing laughter without tremors, meals without rehearsed perfection, and stories told with honesty rather than fear. Practical tools for viewers. If you're watching and wondering how to begin your own healing, here are a few steps that helped me find a trusted listener. A counselor, a clergy member, or a compassionate friend can offer a safe space for your wounds. Engage in creative expression. Writing art, music, any form that lets you externalize feelings can be cathartic. Join a support group. Whether for survivors of abuse, family members of addicts, or parents, peer support dismantles isolation. Establish nurturing rituals. Family story nights, gardening projects, or simple walks can create new memories less tied to fear. Practice self-care. Trauma-informed yoga, deep breathing exercises, or journaling can reconnect you with your body and mind. Looking ahead. As seasons turned from summer's green to autumn's burnished gold, I felt my heart soften in ways I once thought impossible. The nightmares visited less often, and when they did, I could greet them with the calm I'd cultivated on the library steps, in therapy rooms, in neighborhood kitchens. My life, once gridlocked by fear, now pulsed with possibility. Yet healing is not a final destination, but an ongoing journey. Even now, as I sit on this Vermont porch with my grandchildren at my feet, I know that cracks sometimes reappear in the soul's foundation, especially when storms blow through our lives. But I also know that the tools of community creativity and compassion fortify us against any tempest. In our next chapter, we'll explore how these personal transformations ripple across generations, how the trauma and resilience of our families shape cultures, communities, and ultimately our collective story. We'll delve into the legacies we inherit, the patterns we can break, and the love that binds us beyond history's darkest pages. For now, my darling, let these words settle in your heart. Healing is possible even after the deepest wounds. And with each sunrise and each sunflower turning toward the light, we find new reasons to hope, new reason to believe in dawn. As the years passed and my own children grew into adults, I began to see how the shadows of our past stretched beyond our little family. How patterns learned in one generation could echo into the next, unless we paused, reflected, and made conscious choices to break the cycle. In sharing my story with my grandchildren on this very porch, I've often watched their curious eyes drift from the mountains to my face as they ask, "How did you stay strong, Grandma?" And I realize that the answers I give must honor not only my own journey, but the broader tapestry of cultural forces that shaped us. The legacy of mid-century Stoicism. In 1950s, America Stoicism was a prized virtue. Men who returned from war carried medals and emotional burdens that they believed should not be spoken of lest they betray weakness. Women kept households immaculate, ironing sheets and pressing dresses because perfection masked uncertainty. Children learned early that making noise or showing too much feeling was unbecoming. In our Lexington home, my grandfather personified that ideal, rigid, unyielding, a living reminder that feelings were secondary to duty. But as many sociologists and historians note, this cultural stoicism came with a price. A study by the National Institutes of Health has shown that generations raised under strict emotional regimes often experience higher rates of anxiety and depression, not just in themselves, but among their descendants. The silence around trauma meant wounds festered unseen passed from parents who couldn't speak of their pain to children who grew up unsure of how to process their own. Patterns passed down and rewritten. I see traces of our family's history in my own mother's occasional pause, before speaking of hardship in my father's reluctance to show tears, even in joy. Yet I also say how my generation intentionally shifted. My siblings and I were encouraged to talk openly about our feelings, to embrace vulnerability as a strength rather than a liability. When I look at my son, a teacher who integrates mindfulness into his elementary classroom, I recognize the threads we rewove. Instead of telling children that tears are shameful, he reads them books about bravery and sadness, encouraging both. Breaking generational patterns isn't automatic. It requires awareness and effort. I've learned that simply wanting change isn't enough. We need tools and language to address what was once silenced. In our family, we instituted weekly circle time, inspired by Native American talking circles and modern therapeutic practices, where every member, no matter their age, speaks without interruption. We share one highlight and one lowlight of our week. My grandchildren now describe it as our safe spot, a ritual that would have been unthinkable in my grandfather's day. Cultural shifts and the role of community. Across the United States, the past few decades have seen a gradual but profound shift in how we view emotional health. From school curriculums that include social-emotional learning to public figures sharing their mental health struggles, there's a growing recognition that resilience is built not by burying pain, but by acknowledging it. According to the American Psychological Association, rates of adults seeking therapy have doubled in the past 20 years, reflecting a cultural embrace of healing rather than stoic endurance. Yet these changes are uneven. In some communities, especially those that still pride themselves on toughness, discussing trauma remains taboo. The challenge, then, is to extend compassion across cultural divides, recognizing that in many places, the old ways of silence were once survival mechanisms during wars, economic hardship, or systemic oppression. My own family benefited from living in a small upstate town where neighbors knitted a safety net of support. At the same time, I've met women in larger cities who felt isolated because their families still held tightly to mid-century ideals of silence. Honoring our ancestors and choosing our legacy. It's easy to judge the past by today's standards. But I've come to understand that my grandfather's behavior was shaped by real experiences, the brutality of war, the loss of his beloved wife, the rigid hierarchies of the military. In his world, Showing emotion was dangerous. Vulnerability could mean betrayal. When I tell this to my grandchildren, I say, we honor our ancestors by understanding their struggles, not excusing harmful actions, but recognizing context. Then we choose a new path. That path is one of deliberate empathy. In our family gatherings, we read aloud letters from older relatives, stories of joy, hardship, pursuit of the American dream, so that younger generations learn the whole picture, not just the polished achievement, but the stumbles and scars. We emphasize questions over judgments. Grandma, how did you feel when, rather than, what did you do when? This subtle shift invites emotional literacy, a skill many mid-century families never practiced. The science of breaking cycles. Research in epigenetics has shown that trauma can leave chemical marks on DNA, influencing stress responses in descendants. While science continues to explore how to reset these markers, psychologists recommend consistent emotional nourishment, unconditional positive regard, open communication and community support. These aren't just feel-good ideals, they're practical interventions that silence generations of suppressed pain. One afternoon, my granddaughter Emma asked me why people sometimes act scary instead of gentle. I told her about my grandfather's own hidden pain, how the war taught him that emotions could be fatal, so he turned to control instead. Then I explained that by practicing kindness, by speaking our fears, we send signals to our bodies that it's safe to relax. That's how we rewrite not just our stories, but our biology. Common missteps and how to avoid them. Even well-meaning families can stumble. A common mistake is overcorrection, swinging from silence to emotional floodgates without boundaries, which can feel overwhelming, especially to children. I remember one holiday when my sister's new approach to openness led to a 7-hour heart-to-heart marathon around the dinner table. By the end, everyone was exhausted and the youngest cousins were in tears. We learned that safe sharing needs structure, time-limited check-ins, age-appropriate discussions, and the option to pass if someone isn't ready. Another pitfall is assuming that talking solves everything. My father once tried to resolve his lingering guilt by pouring out his story to a group, only to find that spilling the pain without coping strategies left him adrift. That's why storytelling must be paired with practical tools, grounding exercises, supportive peers, and professional guidance when needed. In our family after circle time, we close with 3 breaths of gratitude, anchoring our vulnerability in a moment of calm, passing the torch of resilience. As I guide my grandchildren through their own challenges, school anxieties, friendship dramas, online pressures, I'm mindful of the dual legacy I carry, the trauma I inherited and the resilience I built. I tell them you have roots in strength and struggle. You can draw from both. When Emma had her first panic attack in college, she called and I walked her through a breathing exercise I learned in trauma-informed yoga for 4 counts. Hold for 4, out for 6. She texted later. It worked, Grandma. I felt safe. This passing of tools, stories, rituals, coping skills is the heart of generational healing. We can't change what happened in Lexington 50 years ago, but we can ensure that the next 50 years look different. In sharing both pain and progress, we give young people permission to feel, to speak, and to thrive. A collective tapestry. Ultimately, our individual stories weave into a broader American tapestry, a nation born of immigrants and pioneers, forged in wars and triumphs, grappling with both division and unity. The more we share authentic narratives, complete with cracks and colors, the richer our collective story becomes. We learn that vulnerability is not a liability, but a connective thread. So, my darlings, as you step into your own lives, whether as parents, teachers, neighbors, or friends, remember 2 truths: first, that your feelings matter, and second, that you are not alone. The tables you sit around, the circles you create, the children you nurture, all carry forward the light you kindle today. Looking toward tomorrow. In our final chapter, we'll distill these insights into three guiding principles: awareness, action, and aftercare. We'll craft a simple roadmap for personal and familial resilience, so that whether you're facing your own shadows or supporting someone you love, you'll have both compass and lantern. Until then, may you feel the warmth of shared stories, the beauty of awakened hearts, and the promise that when we break cycles of silence, we open the door to generations of healing and hope. As we come to the close of Grandma Teresa's story, I'd like to leave you with three guiding principles: awareness, action, and aftercare that have carried our family from fear into freedom. Think of them as pillars you can lean on whenever you face shadows in your own life. Awareness. Recognize the patterns. Notice the whispers. Abuse and control rarely arrive in shouts. They begin as small demands, an offhand criticism, an innocent correction, a routine inspection that leaves you second-guessing yourself. These micro-abuses can erode confidence over time. Pay attention to that little voice in your head, whispering, "Am I doing this right?" Or "Will they be mad if I don't?" That's your alarm bell. Honor your feelings. In mid-century America, tears were a sign of weakness. Today we know that emotions are data valuable information about what's happening inside us. When you feel anxious, resentful, or depleted, pause. Ask yourself, what is this emotion telling me? Whether it's exhaustion from overpleasing or dread. Before a certain interaction, acknowledging feelings is the first step toward change. Map your triggers. Keep a small journal or even a note on your phone where you record moments of discomfort. He raised his voice when I asked a question. She sighed when I told her my plans, or I felt my chest tighten when we talked about money. Over time, patterns emerge. That map guides you to the places where you need boundaries most. Action. Choose your response. Set gentle boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They're guidelines that help others understand how to treat you with respect. You might start small. I need a moment to think before responding, or I'm not comfortable discussing this topic right now. Practice using I statements. I feel overwhelmed when voices rise to keep the focus on your experience, not their fault. Build your support circle. No one heals alone. Reach out to friends, family members, clergy, or support group peers who validate your experience. Share your awareness map and ask for perspectives. Sometimes just hearing "I'm here for you" can transform anxiety into courage. Take the small, brave step. It might be as simple as saying no once making a phone call for help or reaching out to a professional counselor. Each action overshadows a lifetime of conditioned helplessness. Remember Teresa's flight to Mrs. Judith's house. That single run saved her life. Your small step can save your spirit. Aftercare. Tend the wounds, create healing rituals. Our family's Friday story night and sunflower planting weren't just traditions, they were acts of nourishment. Find your own rituals, a weekly walk with a friend, a daily gratitude journal, or a monthly creative workshop. These rituals remind you that you're worthy of care and joy. Embrace creative expression. Words. Paint, music, movement. Whatever medium you choose, let it become an outlet for what's inside. Grandma Teresa found refuge at her writing desk. You might find your own sanctuary in a sketchbook or guitar. The act of creation integrates trauma into something beautiful. Monitor and adjust. Healing isn't linear. Some weeks you'll feel strong, others vulnerable. Check in with yourself regularly in your journal, with a therapist, or during a support group meeting. When old fears resurface, remind yourself of the pillars of awareness and action. Adjust your boundaries and rituals as you grow. Your turn. A call to action. Now, dear friends, I invite you to make this journey your own. Share a moment of dawn. In the comments below, tell us about one moment and when you stepped out of fear into light. Perhaps it was speaking up in a meeting, seeking help, or simply choosing self-care. Your story could guide someone else through their night. Like and subscribe. If Teresa's journey touched your heart, click like and subscribe to Grandparents' Tales. Every new subscriber helps us reach those who need to know they're not alone. Join the giveaway. We're celebrating community. Share a bit about yourself, where you live, what brings you joy, or who you're caring for, and you'll be entered in our $1,000 giveaway. But more than the prize, your words weave our communal tapestry of resilience. Download our Resilience Roadmap. Head over to the description for a free PDF that outlines these 3 pillars in a handy worksheet format. Use it to chart your awareness plan, brave actions, and build aftercare rituals. Looking forward, the next chapter in our upcoming video will dig into the art of legacy building, how the choices we make today echo into the lives of our children and grandchildren, shaping family cultures for generations to come. We'll translate awareness, action, and aftercare into daily practices that transform homes and communities. Until then, hold fast to these truths. You deserve respect always. Your feelings are your compass. Every small act of courage rewrites the story. Thank you for sharing these moments with me, my darlings. May your nights be gentle and your dawns abundant with hope.